April 1944. Truk Lagoon, deep in the heart of the Central Pacific. The sun hung low, staining the reef with molten orange light as Japanese soldiers stood at the shoreline, watching smoke drift from the shattered silhouettes of fuel depots bombed days earlier. The water shimmered gently, but the air carried a sharp chemical scent: burnt oil, ruptured tanks, and the ghost of aviation fuel that once powered Japan's aerial ambitions. Across the lagoon, distant American carrier groups patrolled like mobile fortresses, their engines humming in the dusk. For the soldiers on Truk, the contrast was suffocating. They had tasted the limits of their empire. Now they were about to witness what limitless looked like. In the early years of the Pacific War, Japan's naval air arm had been the pride of the imperial forces: elite pilots, disciplined mechanics, and carriers that had swept across the ocean with precision. But the facade of invincibility masked an unchanging truth. Japan had entered a resource war without resources. Aviation fuel, especially the high-octane blends required for carrier fighters, was always the empire's most fragile lifeline. Japan produced only a fraction of what it needed, relying on vulnerable shipments from the Dutch East Indies. Every liter was counted, logged, rationed. Every drop was a measure of national survival. By 1944, the balance of the Pacific had shifted like a tidal wave. Japanese soldiers stationed across their crumbling island bases expected the Americans to face at least some limits of the same kind: exhausted pilots, depleted ships, dwindling fuel reserves. They assumed that the enemy's carrier groups, after weeks at sea, would slow down, retreat, or pause operations to refuel. But what arrived instead was something no one in the Imperial Navy's forward garrisons could have imagined: a moving empire of oil. When American carrier task forces approached the Central Pacific, they brought with them a logistical ecosystem unprecedented in human history. Behind each carrier sailed a floating armada of fleet oilers, fast supply ships designed to refuel entire battle groups while underway. According to U.S. naval records, by mid-1944, the United States possessed over 500 million barrels of petroleum reserves dedicated to military operations. Japan, in contrast, struggled to supply even a tenth of that amount to its entire war effort. A symbolic object threads this narrative: the steel fuel drum. For the Japanese soldiers on Truk, the drum represented scarcity. Rusting containers patched repeatedly, rolled by hand across coral ground, guarded like treasure. For the Americans, that same drum became a symbol of abundance, stacked in endless pyramids across the decks of supply ships, carried by cranes, tossed into landing craft, burned, used, replaced without hesitation. This difference was not theoretical. It was visible, overwhelming, undeniable. When American Hellcats, Avengers, and Helldivers launched wave after wave from distant carriers, Japanese observers timed the operations, expecting them to cease after a few hours. But the attacks continued all day. In some campaigns, American strike waves returned every hour, their fuel tanks refilled at sea almost as fast as they burned them. Naval historians note that during the Marianas operations, U.S. carriers consumed more aviation fuel in a single week than Japan could supply to its entire combined fleet in a month. The Japanese soldiers who witnessed these operations were not merely impressed, they were stunned. Reports retrieved after the war describe entire garrisons standing silently as they observed American ships refueling under combat conditions, a sight previously considered impossible. One Japanese clerk on Ponape recorded that American carriers moved as if anchored to a river of oil, a poetic but painfully truthful assessment. Each refueling line, stretching between ships like a shimmering umbilical cord, reinforced the growing realization: Japan was no longer fighting a navy, it was fighting an industrial civilization. The emotional contrast deepened as Japanese soldiers confronted the limits of their own experience. They were accustomed to cleaning aircraft engines with rags dampened using a spoonful of fuel because nothing could be wasted. They had watched pilots cancel sorties because only enough fuel remained for defensive operations. Some garrisons had not received replacement fuel in months. Crews drained the last drops from damaged aircraft just to keep generators running for a few hours each night. And yet, the Americans arrived with task forces so large, so endlessly supplied, that their fuel drums formed mountains on the decks of their auxiliary ships. The thunder of American engines, powered by that seemingly endless supply, became a sound heavy with symbolism. Every sortie was not merely an attack, it was a demonstration that the United States had solved the central problem of Pacific warfare: distance. Historical evidence reinforces this point. The U.S. Navy's underway replenishment system, perfected in 1943 and 1944, allowed carrier groups to remain at sea for months without returning to port. Admiral Raymond Spruance later wrote that this capability transformed the Pacific Ocean from a barrier into a highway. Japanese forces, by contrast, were trapped at the mercy of their dwindling oil convoys, hounded by American submarines that sank tankers faster than Japan could replace them. By late 1944, Japan's available aviation fuel for carrier operations had fallen to near zero. Pilots could not train, planes sat idle, carriers became empty hulls. That transformation, born from the contrast between scarcity and abundance, changed the way Japanese soldiers perceived the war itself. Many began to understand that the conflict had moved beyond bravery, skill, or tradition. It had become a war of logistics, and the side with the deeper well of oil would shape history. When American Marines eventually captured islands like Saipan, Guam, and Peleliu, they found fuel depots that had run dry months earlier, archives noting ration plants reduced to absurd fractions, and pilots who had flown their last missions on fumes. Japanese soldiers had realized long before the Americans landed that they were confronting a force powered not by chance, but by the full industrial might of a democratic society. In the final months of the war, as Japan's skies dimmed and its fleet lay immobilized by lack of fuel, the memory of those American fuel drums and the unending hum of American carrier engines returned like a final, unavoidable truth. The war had been decided not only in battles, but in the quiet mathematics of oil reserves, transport logistics, and industrial capacity. And so the story ends where it began, at the shoreline of a quiet Pacific island where Japanese soldiers once stared across the water at an enemy whose fuel reserves seemed to defy reason. The steel drum, the symbol of both scarcity and abundance, remains a reminder that wars are won not only by courage, but by the ability of a free nation to gather its strength, sustain its momentum, and carry its ideals across the vastest oceans. In not truth lies the larger meaning. Abundance, when harnessed by a democratic people, becomes not merely a resource, but a force capable of reshaping history itself.